Okay, so let's take a look a little deeper at the complex ions formed by transition metals. Specifically, let's draw out an orbital diagram of iron 3 plus. So iron 3 plus. So normally, if iron had all of its electrons, what it would look like would be something like this. Okay, but iron loses 3 of its electrons to become the ion, the cation, iron 3 plus. So we're going to remove the highest energy electrons, 1, 2, and 3. And this is what the orbital diagram of iron 3 plus looks like. Okay, now what happens when we add a ligand? So with the addition of a ligand, so plus ligand, what happens is these 3d orbitals actually split. Some of the orbitals become at a higher energy. Some of them destabilize, meaning they're no longer as stable as the initial 3d orbitals, and so they are at a higher energy. On the other hand, some of the orbitals stabilize. Some of them become stabilized, meaning that they're at a lower energy, like this. Okay, and this is with the addition, again, of this ligand. So that's the important part. As we add ligands, our 3d, or just overall d sublevel orbitals, tend to split. Okay, and what iron 3 plus looks like then is that we have some electrons here, again, filling up from the lowest energy level, one at a time, and then pairing. Okay, and so to create different colors, what happens is a specific electron within that split d orbital actually absorbs a photon of light and is excited to the destabilized d orbital. So it jumps up to the d orbital that has been destabilized, absorbs just the right amount of energy from light, and produces a specific color of light. Okay, we're going to look at how it does that, but first, the amount of energy required for this electron to jump is different depending on the material, but it's given a specific name. It's called the crystal field splitting energy. Crystal field splitting, splitting energy. Okay? And it just so happens that that amount of energy is in the visible spectrum of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now, why do these 3D or any D sublevel orbitals split? That's the big question. Well, to figure out the answer to that question, you need to take a look at the shape of the D orbitals. So again, there's 5 D orbitals in the D sublevel. So each of these shapes corresponds to one of these boxes up here. And again, this shape is really a probability field of where the electron is going to be with a high probability. Okay? So if we take a look, you'll notice that they're oriented along the X, Y, and Z axis in different ways. And that's actually very important. Sometimes when our ligands bond, they bond in what is known as an octahedral geometry. So let me show you that, octahedral. So what it looks like is when we have our central metal ion in the middle, and then we have our ligands all around in this shape where we have some at 90 degrees to each other. Actually, they're all at 90 degrees. So this is all 90 degrees, right? If we were to draw an axis, so if we were to draw the XY axis on this octahedral diagram, let me just make sure it's the same as this guy. So we would put the z-axis here, the y-axis along here, and the x-axis, if you can picture it, coming out of the page. Now what you really need to notice is each of the ligands are attached to my metal ion along the axis. So they're basically attached along the x, y, and z axis. These electrons that are being donated in that coordinate bond are bonding along the xy axis, which is a problem because if you take a look, there are certain electrons that are already along the x, y, and z axis. So let's do octahedral in, let's say blue. Oops. So if we were to take a look at the electrons, you'll notice that electrons in the dz squared orbital are directly along the x and y axis. Similarly, electrons in the dx squared minus dy squared orbital are also along that axis. And so we have negative electrons from our ligand. Oops. So we have negative electrons from our ligand trying to go in and form a bond along these axes. However, there are electrons in those orbitals along that axis. And what results is we have, in the octahedral shape, we have two orbitals, aka these two orbitals, that are much higher energy because there's already that negative electron, and these three orbitals which are much lower energy. So we have d sublevel splitting, and this transfer is known as d to d electron transfer. So it's not going up an energy level. This electron is going from a higher energy d sublevel, a lower energy d sublevel to a higher energy d sublevel. Sorry, brain fart. Okay? So that's why we get these splittings. And the pattern actually depends on our geometry. If, for example, our ligands did not attach themselves in an octahedral way, but instead attach themselves in something called a tetrahedral way, which is this shape right here, let's take a look at what that would imply. So tetrahedral means that if we were to draw our x, y, and z again along our shape, so z is here, y is here, and x is here. Okay, draw that a little better. Okay, hopefully that you can see that my ligands here are now, one is bonding along the z-axis, and then we have three that are sort of between my x and y. So let's take a look at what that means. So if we were to take a look at which orbitals would be in the way of these ligands, hopefully you can see that once again, my d z squared is along the z axis, so it's going to be in the way of those ligands trying to bond. It's going to go to a higher level because negative and negative does not like to be close to each other. Similarly, we need to also take into account that these ligands are in between the x and y, and so again, this orbital, the dxy, is also going to be higher level because it's in the way of bonding ligands. And so when we're talking about a tetrahedral arrangement, these two orbitals are higher energy because those electrons take more energy to be around already negative ligands. And then these three orbitals are lower energy. So we have a different splitting pattern. Let's just write that out just in case. So the pattern depends on geometry. Again, so we're talking about either octahedral or tetrahedral. Depends on geometry. Okay, so for example, in my octahedral bonding, so when my ligands bond at 90 degrees to each other around my metal ion, what ends up happening is we get 3 d orbitals that become much higher energy, the ones that are along the x, y, and z axis, and 2 d orbitals that are lower energy, the ones that are not along the x, y, z axis. When we have a tetrahedral shape, on the other hand, then what we end up getting is we end up getting 2 d orbitals that are higher energy, the one along the z axis and the one between the xy axis, and 3 that are lower energy level. Now I specifically drew these distances on purpose. So the distance between split d orbitals in octahedral is quite a lot larger than the distance between split orbitals in tetrahedral. And so what you'll end up having is octahedral shaped ligand and a metal ion complex will need shorter wavelengths. So shorter wavelengths meaning more energy, and tetrahedral will need longer, so less energy to jump up to that closer, relatively, split d orbital. Okay? Now, the other part that the other factors that dictate the crystal field splitting energy are 3 in number. So let's write that down. Okay, so the first thing, we already talked about the geometry. Again, so octahedrally bonded ligands tend to generate a greater difference between the split d orbitals. So the geometry. Okay. The second thing that affects the crystal field splitting energy is the charge on the metal ion. Okay. The last thing that depends, or that affects the crystal field splitting energy, is the charge density of the ligand. And there's actually a table in your data booklet that tells you from lowest to highest which ligands will cause a greater splitting energy. Okay, so let me just find that table. So it looks something like a list. It's called Spectrochemical Series. It's section 15. So again, this is section 15. And what it does is it tells you which are the strongest field ligands and which ones are the weakest. So if you take a look, you'll see iodine is the very lowest listed ligand, so it causes the least splitting of d orbitals, absorbs the longest wavelength of light, and then we follow on with a few more halogens, sulfur, okay, ... I'll let you look up the rest, and we have some strong ligands. So strong field ligands cause more splitting of d orbitals, and they absorb shorter wavelengths of light. So things like NH3 and Cn minus. Okay, so this can be found in your table 15, and basically the stronger the field ligand is, then the more splitting will occur. The greater the distance between the split d orbitals, and the more energy is required for these electrons to make this d to d transition. That should say transition. D to D transition.